Ben Carson persevered through many trials, and over a period of 25 years has now been the director of pediatric neurosurgery at one of the world's great hospitals, Johns Hopkins Children's Center. He is a member of the Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Science, the Horatio Alger Society of Distinguished Americans, and many others. In 2001, Dr. Carson was named by CNN and Time magazine as one of the nation's 20 foremost physicians and scientists. In 2008, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, our highest civilian honor. Dr. Carson has been married for 37 years to his wife, Candy, and is the father of 3 sons. And yes, his mother, Sonia Carson, the woman who refused to go on welfare because she never saw anyone come off it, helped to make all of this possible. Ladies and gentlemen, his dream was bold. His impact was and is becoming legendary. Won't you all help me to welcome Dr. Benjamin Carson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Candy and I are absolutely delighted to be here with you tonight. And, you know, Charlotte is one of my favorite cities in America. It's undergone such a revolution over the last 10 years. Everybody should be very proud of that. And we had a chance to reconnect with our friends, the Grays here, Festa and Dan, their daughter, we hadn't seen for quite some time. And then we had a chance to go earlier today to the school. And what a treat that was to see how well behaved the children are and how they're able to recite long passages and just the singing. Everything was really quite beautiful. And this is a wonderful project. And I think if all the students of America had an opportunity to have this kind of an education, we'd have far fewer problems than we have now, that's for sure. But I want to thank all of you for getting involved. Now, you know, as a youngster, I was only interested in becoming a doctor. I used to hear the mission stories in church and Sabbath school, and they frequently featured missionary doctors who seemed like the most noble people on the face of the earth, traveling all over the world at great personal expense and inconvenience to bring not only physical but mental and spiritual healing to people. And I said, this is the most noble thing a person can do. So I decided when I was 8 years old that I was going to be a missionary doctor. And that continued to be my dream until I was 13. At which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out. Psychiatrist was in. Now, I didn't know any psychiatrists, but on TV they seemed like rich people, you know. They drove Jaguars, lived in the fancy mansions, had these big plush offices, and all they had to do was talk to crazy people all day. It seemed like I was doing that anyway, so I said, this is going to work out extremely well. And I started reading Psychology Today. I was a local shrink in high school. Everybody brought me their problems. I would sit them down and stroke my chin, say, tell me about your mama. And then I majored in psychology in college, and I did advanced psych in medical school. And I was gung-ho. I was going to be the world's greatest psychiatrist. And then I started meeting a bunch of psychiatrists. Need I say more? I'm just kidding. Some of my best friends are psychiatrists. But what I discovered very quickly is what psychiatrists do in real life and what they do on television are two completely different things. What they do in real life is much more important than what you see on television. And they're some of the more intellectual members of the medical community, but it just wasn't what I wanted to do. So I had to stop and say, now what? And I believe God gives everybody special gifts and talents. And I said, well, what are your special gifts and talents? And as I analyzed my life, I realized that I had a lot of eye-hand coordination, the ability to think in 3 dimensions. I was a very careful person, never knocked things over and said, oops, which is a good characteristic for a brain surgeon, by the way. And I love to dissect things. So I put all that together with my love of the brain, and I said, you should become a neurosurgeon. Now, some people thought that was a pretty strange idea, because at that time, there had only ever been 8 black neurosurgeons in the world. So people said, are you sure this is what you want to do? But, you know, it was where my talent was, and it's the area that the Lord was leading me into. And, you know, I pursued it, and I started out as an adult neurosurgeon. But I very quickly discovered that no matter how good an operation you did on those chronic back pain patients, they never got any better until they got their settlement. Whereas with the pediatric patients, you know, what you see is what you get. If they felt good, you know they felt good. If they felt bad, you know they felt bad. And you can operate for 10, 12, 16 hours on a kid. And if you're successful, the reward may be 40, 50, 60 years of life. Whereas with an old geezer, you spend all that time operating, and they die in 5 years of something else. So I like to get a big return on my investment. And you do too, and that's why you're here tonight. But, you know, it's wonderful because, you know, the children really are our future. And it's almost impossible to invest too much in them. And yet, we're in a situation where we're robbing them of their future financially. And that is really a very, very serious issue. But I'm not going to get into that tonight. But I will just say one thing about the children. We need to try to raise them in an atmosphere where people feel free to express their opinions. And we don't allow the PC police to shut everybody down and to shut down all conversation. Because the goal of the PC police is to keep everybody silent while they undermine everything without a conversation and completely change the fundamental structure of society and never even have to debate it. And people have to be smarter than that and not allow themselves to be silenced. And, you know, I've been overwhelmed by the number of correspondence that I've gotten from Americans across the land who have been silenced, who said they were elderly people and they were just waiting to die because they had given up on America. And now they felt maybe there was some hope. But there's an enormous amount of hope, and it doesn't have anything to do with me. It has to do with whether people are willing to speak up for what they believe and not be bludgeoned into silence. This is crucial for the next generation because we don't want to have a bunch of zombies just walking around, everybody saying the same thing and doing the same thing. That's not what America was about. That's not what freedom of speech and freedom of expression was all about. And we don't have to all agree in order to be friends. In fact, I always say if 2 people feel the same about everything, one of them isn't necessary. And you know, the emphasis should not be on unanimity of speech and unanimity of thought. The emphasis should be on learning how to be respectful of people with whom you disagree. And we've just lost it. We've lost the emphasis. Well, you know, unfortunately, you know, my dreams of becoming a physician were derailed somewhat early on when my parents got divorced. That was a pretty devastating thing. And unfortunately, You know, my mother discovered that my father was a bigamist, had another family. And obviously that destroyed their marriage. And we ended up moving to Boston to live with her older sister and brother-in-law. Typical tenement, large multi-family dwelling, boarded up windows and doors, sirens and gangs and murders. I remember seeing people lying on the ground with bullet holes and stab wounds dying. Both of my older cousins, whom we adored, were killed. And as a youngster, I really didn't expect to live to be beyond 25 years of age, because that's what I was used to seeing. But my mother was out working multiple jobs at a time, her hope being that somehow we could eventually return to Detroit. And eventually we were able to do that, still in a dilapidated, horrible section, but at least she was independent. And the thing about my mother, as difficult as her life was, she was one of 24 children, got married at age 13, had only a third-grade education, discovered that her husband was a bigamist. Through all that, she never felt sorry for herself. And that was a good thing. The problem is she never felt sorry for us either. So, you know, there was never an excuse that you could come out with that was satisfactory. You know, she would always say, "Do you have a brain?" And if the answer was yes, then you could have thought your way out of that. And you know, I really think that that was perhaps the best thing that she did for my brother and for me, not accepting excuses. You know, when I think of people who were not excuse makers, I'm reminded of Chang and Ing Bunker, citizens of North Carolina. You know, they were the original Siamese twins, born in Siam, now Thailand, in the year 1811. They were the ones who made Barnum and Bailey famous. They were joined at the chest, something we call Thoracophagus or Xiphopagus. Traveled all over the world. Eventually left the circus and moved here, where they became farmers. Now, can you imagine that? Being a farmer, stuck to somebody's chest, staring them in the face 24/7, smelling their breath 24/7, and not using that as an excuse? I mean, today, people hurt their little pinky, and they want workman's comp for the rest of their lives. I mean, these guys were not excuse makers. And not only were they successful farmers, but they got married to 2 different women. And between them, no pun intended, they had 21 children. So you can see they were fairly creative fellas also. But interestingly enough, their wives couldn't stand each other. So they had to live with one wife one week and the other wife the next week. So they ran 2 successful farms, and they lived until they were 63 years old, which is much older than most people lived back in those days. What does that say about just sucking it up and moving on and not complaining and not griping? You know, this is something that is almost lost in our nation now. Everyone has become a victim. Everybody has become entitled. Nobody wants to work. What if John Kennedy were here today? And what if he went to the convention that was held right here in Charlotte last year, and he had said, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." He would have been run out of town. You know, that's how much things have changed. And yet, those abiding principles of self-directed accomplishment is what made America into a great nation, and something we should sorely be trying to induce into our young people. It will make all the difference in the world. Well, after we moved back to Detroit, you know, I was in school. I was a horrible student, perhaps the worst you have ever seen. I thought I was really stupid. My classmates agreed. And in fact, my nickname was Dummy. That's what everybody called me. If there was ever a joke about somebody being stupid, you could believe I was the butt of the joke. But I had a way of getting back at my classmates. I was very good at one thing, and that was getting other people kicked out of class. I was an expert at that. What I would do is I would study my classmates. I would figure out what made them really, really angry. And then I would just irritate them until they were about to explode. But I would never push the last button to make them explode until we were in class and the teacher was nearby. And then I would do it, they would explode, the teacher would kick them out. I would say, yeah, this is great, because I wouldn't be the only one who didn't learn anything that day. But there was this one girl in class. You all know who this girl is. Her name is Miss Goody Two-Shoes. You know who I'm talking about? Some of you were her, I'm sure. Everything pristine, perfect, on time, made everybody else look like a total jerk. I said, wow, wouldn't it be great to get her kicked out of class? There was only one problem. She was cool, calm, and collected. You couldn't get under her skin. But I was persistent. And I finally discovered what made her angry. And I got to tell you, the steam was coming out of her ears. She was about to explode, but I didn't push the last button. I waited till we were in class. Lo and behold, she sat right down in the desk in front of me. I said, the Lord is good. And as the teacher approached, I started irritating her. I pushed the last button, but she didn't explode. She just calmly turned around, and she said, you and me on the playground at recess. So that didn't work out all that well. You know, I became a brain surgeon, and she became a professional wrestler. But I did stop bothering people. But, you know, the kind of student I was, shameful. And unfortunately, there are students like that today. And they abound throughout our nation. We have a 30% high school dropout rate across the nation, averaged. Much higher in some of our larger cities. And that is during the information age. You know, during the agricultural age, all you needed was a strong back and a willingness to work. It didn't matter whether you had all the book learning or not. Same thing was true in the industrial age. But now we're in the information age, the age of technology. Knowledge is power. We cannot afford to have a third of our students not graduating from high school. And it's one of the reasons that we do so poorly in a lot of international surveys, because we're not putting the right emphasis on education. And when we do see institutions that are working hard to instill the right thing, we need to do the best that we can to support them. And that's why I'm glad all of you are here tonight. It's one of the reasons that my wife, Candy, and I started our fund, the Carson Scholars Fund, where we give out scholarships to students starting in the 4th grade from all backgrounds for superior academic performance and demonstration of humanitarian qualities. You have to have both qualities. You can't just be smart. You got to care about people. Hitler was smart. You know, the Marquis de Sade was smart, but they didn't care about people. You need both components, because that has been historically one of the real fabrics of America, compassion. You see, we have always been people who've taken care of each other. There has never been a time when there were masses of people anywhere in this country laying on the street starving and not being taken care of. And in fact, if you go back into history, you will find that America was responsible for socialism. How so, you say? Because the Europeans looked over here and they said, wait a minute, look at those silly Americans. They were looking at the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and the Fords and the Kellogg's and the Carnegies and the Mellons. They said, those people have way too much money. and nobody else has any money, you can't run a country like that. You have to have an overarching government that receives the funds and redistributes it in an equitable way. So you see, we were the ones who actually inspired socialism. But what they didn't realize is that all of those people that I just named and many more like them, instead of just hoarding money unto themselves and passing it down from generation to generation, use their money to build the infrastructure of this nation, to build the transcontinental railroad, to build textile mills and factories, to create the largest middle class the world has ever seen, to build universities and museums and all kinds of charitable foundations. That's the history of America. As late as 2009, 40 of the wealthiest families in America pledged to give away half of their wealth to charities. Now go to China or Europe or someplace and ask the 40 wealthiest families to give away half of their wealth. They'll look at you like you got 6 heads. You know, it's an American phenomenon. When there's a disaster in the world anywhere, who's always first in line to give away resources? We are. So we are inherently a caring people. And this is the absolute last place on earth where we should be talking about class warfare. You know, that is a political stunt that has nothing to do with reality. But we have to be smart enough not to allow it to drive wedges. Because the fact of the matter is, we're all in the same boat. And if part of the boat sinks, eventually the rest of it's going down too. And that's why we need to all be concerned about each other. And for every one of those young people that we keep from going down that path of self-destruction, it's one less person we have to protect ourselves and our families from. One less person we have to pay for in the penal system or the welfare system. One more tax-paying productive member of society who may discover the cure for cancer or a new energy source. We can't afford to throw any of them away. They are all vital to the success of this nation. And that's why, again, when we see programs like this is vitally important to all of us. And even in a selfish way, if you look at it in a selfish way, the money you invest up front saves you a whole lot of money later on in life. And also, it makes you feel good. And that's a very important part. Another part of the Carson Scholars Fund is we put in reading rooms all over the country, particularly targeting Title I schools, where a lot of the kids come from homes with no books and they go to a school with no library. Those are the ones who wind up dropping out. And we put in these reading rooms, which are places that no kid would possibly pass up. And they get points for the number of books they read and the number of hours they spend in there. They can trade them in for prizes. Initially, they do them for the prizes, but it doesn't take long before it begins to reflect significantly in their academic performance. Those are the kinds of things that we have to be thinking about. Because there was a time when public education in America was the envy of the world. We started our dramatic decline about in the 1930s, when we began to introduce political correctness more so into the curriculum than the basics of learning. And that has not been particularly useful. And in my own particular case, you know, I was fortunate enough to have a mother who wanted me to read, even though I was a horrible student. My brother was a horrible student. She noticed in the homes where she worked as a domestic that those people read a lot of books, and they didn't watch a lot of television. And after praying for wisdom, she came up with the idea of turning off the TV. Imagine that. And making us read books. 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Library each week, and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. And she would put little check marks and highlights and underlines, and we would think she was going over these things with a fine-tooth comb. But, you know, I hated it. It seemed to me like cruel and unusual punishment. And everybody else was outside playing. And my mother's friends criticized her. They said, you can't make boys stay in the house reading books. They're supposed to be outside running and playing and climbing trees. They'll grow up and they'll hate you. And I said, Mother, you know they're right. But she would not listen, and we had to do it. But interestingly enough, after a while, I actually began to enjoy reading those books. And, I started reading about people of great accomplishment. And I noticed one thing about them. They tended to accept responsibility onto themselves. They didn't make excuses, and they worked very hard on what they believed. And those stories were so encouraging to me because up until that point, I hated poverty. Some people hate spiders, some people hate scorpions and snakes. I hated poverty. I couldn't stand it until I started reading those books. And as I read more and more about great people, I realized that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. You get to make the decisions. You get to decide how much energy you want to put into them. And once that became clear to me, poverty didn't bother me because I knew it was temporary. I knew that I could change that. And, if I tell you to stick your foot into a bucket of ice water, you're probably not going to want to do that. But if you know you can take it right back out, it's not so bad. And that's the situation that I found myself in. And that was an incredible liberation for me. But, that slide that was being shown earlier by Dr. Larson with, the 100 black males and then the number that actually went to college and finished, that's really a very sobering statistic. Many people say the black male in America is an endangered species. Why do they say that? Because there are more young black males in the penal system than there are in higher education. That the number one cause of death for young black males is homicide in our major cities. It is a disaster. And yet, anybody involved in the field of education knows that young black males are good students in kindergarten, first grade, second grade. Something begins to happen as they reach into the higher grades. That peer pressure begins to take over, that need to be cool. And then they started reading their American history book, and they noticed there's nobody in there who looks like them who really made any substantial contribution to America. And they say, well, next year when I take world history, maybe I'll see somebody, and they don't see anybody then either. And they say, well, what do my ancestors do? And then they come home and they turn the TV on. Oh, there we are, playing basketball, baseball, football, rapping in those baggy pants, acting a fool on some sitcom. And you begin to develop a very aberrant image of what success for you involves. And it doesn't seem to include being the CEO of a Fortune 500 company or being a nuclear physicist. And by the time that young man realizes that he's not going to be the next Michael Jordan or the next Puffy Daddy or one of these rap singers, what's left? Along comes this big black BMW with tinted glass, and out steps this tall guy with furs and jewels and women. You want to be like me? I can show you how to get all this stuff. Besides that, that society sold you a bill of goods. They owe you. The next thing you know, you're looking at the 6 o'clock news and you see this young man being led away by the police in handcuffs, trying to shield his face from the camera. And you said, that looks like little Johnny. He was such a good boy. What happened? Having committed some heinous crime. The same little Johnny who was such a good boy. But that happens to little Johnnies across this nation hundreds of times every day. Precious lives being sent to a system that destroys them. And it never had to happen. Because anybody in this room could have taken little Johnny by the hand when he was 6 years old. Could have walked down the streets of Charlotte, North Carolina. Could have given him a black history lesson that he would have never forgotten. Could have started by pointing to his shoes and saying, you know, it was Jan Matzliger, a black man who invented the automatic shoe lasting machine, which revolutionized the shoe industry throughout the world. And you step on that clean street, it was Charles Brooks, a black man who invented the street sweepers, those machines with the big brushes. And down that street comes a big refrigerated tractor trailer truck, and you tell them it was Frederick Jones, a black man who invented the refrigeration system for trucks, later adopted for airplanes, boats, and trains. And it comes to a stop at the red light, you tell them it was Garrett Morgan, a black man who invented the traffic signal. And you can also tell how he invented the gas mask, saved lots of lives during the war. And while you're talking about the war, Henrietta Bradbury, a black woman who invented the underwater cannon, made it possible to launch torpedoes from submarines. And you'll see a beautiful black woman walking down the street. A black man did not invent her, but you can use that opportunity to talk about Madam C.J. Walker, a black woman who invented cosmetic products for women of dark complexion, was the first woman of any nationality in the United States to become a millionaire on her own efforts. And you walk past the hospital, Charles Drew, contributions to blood banking, understanding of the function of blood plasma. Daniel Hale Williams, the first successful open heart surgery in the world, had an operative mortality rate less than 1.5%. You look up at the surgical light, Thomas Edison. You didn't know he was black, did you? Well, actually, he wasn't. But his right-hand man, Lewis Latimer, was. You can tell how Lewis Latimer came up with the filament that made the light bulb work for more than 2 or 3 days, how he invented the electric lamp, did pioneering work in incandescent and fluorescent lighting, diagrammed the telephone for Alexander Graham Bell, was a tremendous inventor in his own right. Most people never heard of him. You walk past the railroad tracks, Andrew Beard, the automatic railroad car coupler, spurred on the Industrial Revolution. Elijah McCoy, the automatic lubrication system for locomotive engines. In fact, Elijah McCoy had so many inventions, every time something would come out, people would say, is that a McCoy? Is that the real McCoy? That's where the term came from. You got racist people like David Duke talking about the real McCoy. Don't even know he's paying homage to. And you know what? I'm just barely scratching the surface of the lesson that that young man could have had. And he should realize that his ancestors played a very important role in the development of this country. And he should feel fully invested and fully a part of this nation and want everything successful to happen in this nation. But you know, I can take that same walk down the street for virtually any nationality in this country. And I can point out all kinds of contributions that were made, because that is why America reached the pinnacle much faster than any other place in the history of the world. It's because we had so many people from so many diverse backgrounds with so much talent. Our diversity is not a problem, it's a strength. And we need to remember that. And as we remember that and use that, it's really only very small-minded people who look on the surface and make judgments. You know, I was doing an NPR interview, and the interviewer said, Dr. Carson, you don't speak about race very often. Why is that? And I said, it's because I'm a neurosurgeon. And she looked at me quizzically. What the heck does that? She wasn't saying that, but that's what she was thinking by the look on her face. And I said, you see, when I take someone to the operating room and I cut the scalp and peel it back and take off the bone flap and open the dura, I'm operating on what makes that person who they are. The cover doesn't make them who they are. And I have the ability to appreciate that. And most people don't think that deeply. They just think about what's on the surface, which means very little, if anything. And we have to learn how to examine things and look at the things in their depth and look at the long-term implications of things. Those are the kinds of things that will save this nation. And that's why we have these very complex brains that we have. Billions and billions of neurons. It remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard, can process more than 2 million bits of information per second. There is nothing that compares to the human brain. And we need to start using it, though. You know, with the reason we have these gigantic frontal lobes as opposed to all other animals is because that's where you do your rational thought processing. We're the only creatures God made have the ability to extract information from the past and the present, project it into the future, to plan and strategize deep into the future. And yet many people forfeit that, and they just react to what's going on without giving a thought to the future. And that is not the heritage. That is a human heritage that belongs to us. Well, you know, as I learned these lessons, you know, my grades improved dramatically. Reading, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class. The same students who used to call me dummy in the 5th grade were coming to me in the 7th grade. Benny, how do you work this problem? I'd say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But, you know, I just had a very different impression of who I was. And what does that say about the mindset that we give to these young people in terms of what they are able to accomplish? Really, when you stop and think about it, very important part of education. You know, when Alexis de Tocqueville came to America to study this nation, he wanted to know, why is it, when he came in 1831, that a nation barely 50 years old could already compete with all the powers of the world on virtually every level? There had never been anything like that before. And when he looked at our educational system, he was duly impressed. But one of the things that truly impressed him is that in our schools, we taught values. They actually read from the Bible. They actually taught the difference between right and wrong. And he concluded that that had an enormous amount to do with the success of this nation. And at the end of that 2-volume gigantic set, his concluding words were, America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. And his words were very prophetic. But you know, I don't think that we've actually turned that corner yet where we're not good. And I want you to think about what happens to the world if we fade from the scene and somebody else becomes a superpower. Think about the implications of that. We have used our superpower status very judiciously. Have we always done the right thing? Absolutely not. Do we have faults? Absolutely. But if you go back and you study the history of the world, and you look at dominating powers and what they have done to the rest of the world, you realize that America is very, very benign. And what comes behind us is unlikely to be benign at all. And it's one of the reasons that it's so important that we remain strong. And one of the reasons that it's important that we speak up for the values, that we teach our young people the values. See, at Brookstone, they teach values. They don't just teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. And that's why so many of those students are coming out with such an advantage and such an edge. And we need to make these kinds of schools pop up all over the country, quite frankly. We need to do everything we can to bring back a system of values. You know, there are a lot of people who say any values that are based on God and on the Bible should not be taught, particularly in a public school. You know, where did they get this kind of stuff from, I wonder? You know, our scholarship fund Our scholarship fund, our slogan is Think Big, and each one of those letters means something. The last letter, G, is for God. So some lawyers came to us a few years back, and they said, you can't put your Think Big banners up in a public school because the G stands for God. And the First Amendment says there can be no government sponsorship of religious expression. Well, I reminded them that the First Amendment also says there can be no government suppression of religious expression. So we had a rather vigorous argument. And I suggested that we resolve it at the level of the Supreme Court, which seems like a bold and reckless statement, but it really wasn't, because I knew the very next week I was going to the Supreme Court to receive the Jefferson Award. So I figured I would ask while I was there, and I did. And just as Sandra Day O'Connor said, they were all wet. They had no idea what they were talking about. Of course that was not a violation. And people who say silly stuff like that, how much do they really know about the origins of our nation? How much do they know about the writings of our founding fathers? In the book America the Beautiful, the reason that Candy and I put the actual quotes from the founding fathers rather than a reinterpretation of what they were saying is because there's been so much rewriting of history. And you can see that they were God-fearing men. And in the last Congressional Congress, when they came together to try to put together the Constitution, the whole thing was about to fall apart. They were squabbling. They couldn't, it sounds very much like what's going on today, quite frankly. The whole thing was about to break apart. The small states wanted one thing, the large states wanted something else. And before it broke apart, the elder statesman, Benjamin Franklin, stood up in front of that assembly and he said, gentlemen, stop. He said, during the Revolutionary War, every other phrase out of your mouth was, God save us. And now you don't even want to talk about God. And he went on to give an eloquent and lengthy discussion of God. And he says, let's get down on our knees and let's pray and let's ask God to give us wisdom. And they all knelt down and they prayed, and when they got up, they put together a 16 1/3 page document known as the Constitution of the United States of America, which has stood the test of time and was an ingenious document that guarded against the excesses of man and the natural tendency of man to grow government and to grow his own power. Unfortunately, many people have neglected what it says now. They have forgotten what it says. But it's not too late to bring that back either. But I think the first thing we have to bring back are godly principles of loving your fellow man, of caring about your neighbor, of developing your God-given talents to the utmost so that you become valuable to the people around you, of having values and principles that guide our lives. And if we do that, not only will we remain a pinnacle nation, but we will truly have one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much.